to join with me to talk about demand-driven S&OP. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. And obviously, we would love to answer any questions you may have. So there's a substantial differentiation, I believe, in what demand-driven S&OP is about. And to do that, to communicate that well, I think we have to take a look at what traditional sales and operations planning is about and how it works. So we're going to take some time talking about the guiding principles. The methodology has been around for the last few decades. We want to talk about some of the points of failure that we see in traditional sales and operations planning. And then we'll talk about the differentiators. And I call it the search for relevance, because I think that there is an important distinction here that I want to make sure we get across in terms of a more modern approach or a more effective approach for doing sales and operations planning. And then we'll kind of talk about the constructs of DDS and OP at the end, the way it's been described by the Demand Driven Institute. And clearly, if you have questions along the way, please ask, because I want to make sure that we're kind of communicating clearly here and that we're kind of getting to the same level of understanding. So let's go back. Let's rewind the clock to when Dick Ling first brought sales and operations planning together. This goes back to the late 80s, early 90s kind of time frame. Organizations that started to really start applying computers into manufacturing and distribution environments. They were starting to utilize MRP as a concept, and they were finding that there was still these misalignments. So the whole idea behind S&OP was that we needed to bring all of the business elements together into more alignment, because the left hand and the right hand weren't connecting to each other in a positive way, and people saw that there would be further opportunities that they could improve. So the idea is to align our operations to what we expect to sell in the market. In other words, balance our demand expectations with what our supply needs should be to meet those market requirements. Through that, we should be able to manage inventory in a more effective way. And if we do this well, we'll have more visibility across the organization. Get everybody on the same page, make sure that we all see the same set of priorities, and let's move forward then in a much more coordinated way. And you really can't argue with the priorities that were verbalized by Dick and those others at the time around what are we trying to accomplish here, because if we can work together as a team, especially in some of the larger organizations, we should be able to get substantial benefits out of this. So really it involved kind of these process steps. Generating a forecast. What is it that the market's going to require from us? And there's kind of two sides of the same coin between a forecast and what a demand plan is. Some people call it forecasting, some people call it demand planning, some people think of them as specific activities. I kind of think of them as all part of the same topic, which is understanding what our market requirements are going to be so that we can build a supply plan to meet those needs. In the S&OP process, then there's something called a pre-S&OP meeting, where kind of the middle management layer works together to agree what is the plan they're going to present to the senior executives in the company, which would then ratify that, yeah, this is the plan we're going to chase. This is the market assumption we're believing that we need to be able to address. And here's the supply plans that we're going to implement to ensure that we can meet that requirement out into the market. From that decision point, then we'll march forward and go about trying to execute against that plan. In my experience with IBM, I was VP of operations in the consulting business, first in North America and then over in Europe. We had a process called the fall plan, which was our S&OP process. It was kind of run on an annual basis. And then we had quarterly management systems that tied in. There was a substantial amount of effort that went into doing what we called S&OP, or our fall plan process. And so I kind of had quite a visceral experience with this, as I was kind of the leading executive managing that along with my finance counterpart in our division, respectively each year. And I found that there was a lot of effort that went into that. And at times you had to question whether or not you were really getting results out of it. And I think as we look at other clients, they've seen that there's some challenges to this. So let's talk a little bit more about what are the underpinnings here, and then we'll get into what's different about DDS and OP. So the forecasting process, lots of ways to do a forecast. I'd say more often than not, it's based on some statistical or historically based view of what our demand patterns have been and what our consumption rates have been out in the market. And from that, then there will be some iterations, some modifications made to say, hey, if we sold 100 million or in the same quarter last year, we should be able to do 10%, 12%, 15% more this year. And so there's some massaging of that will happen. Different departments will have a voice in this. The sales organization, maybe marketing will have a voice in it. Regional functionals leaders will have a voice. And there will be a fairly rigorous activity that goes into massaging the forecast, trying to blend both the historical data along with other information that we have available to us to come up with a more accurate forecast to go forward with. And that can be, frankly, down at the item level, but more often than not, it's done at category levels. It may be done in monthly buckets instead of weekly buckets, or in some cases, it's going to be done in quarterly buckets. So if you go client to client to client, you're going to see different implementations that have been put in place as they see the best way for them to be able to manage this process. The demand plan then becomes kind of I think of it as the formalization of what the forecast is telling us. It's now gone through some rigor, some, iterative review. Further adjustments may be made based on different perspectives that are added. And, whether we're aggregating or disaggregating, people are getting to a level where they say, yeah, this is representative of what we expect we're going to be selling over the coming time horizon. And that can be anything from a quarter to as much as 78 weeks in some environments. And I want you to think about that a little bit, because we're going to talk about relevant ranges as we get deeper into the presentation here, and some key insights that I think are important to recognize about how far out should we be going and what is most material for us to be focused on. That demand plan will get socialized, there'll be further feedback, but at some point it kind of becomes kind of the case that we're running against. Now, the concept is we're going to build a supply plan. How do we ensure that we have the materials and the products and the manufacturing capacity to meet that demand plan? There's going to be impacts perhaps to our suppliers, to our vendors, even to our own production sites in terms of, do we have enough capacity to meet that plan? Are there going to be execution risks that we need to deal with? Can our suppliers keep up? Do we need to collaborate with them to ensure they're aligned and in touch with us? In the automotive industry, there's a fair bit of choreography around this, with rolling forecasts that go out over typically about a quarter's horizon. That helps bring signals into the S&OP process. But even then, you heard Erik talking about they're starting down the process of really trying to make S&OP a more formal process in their own environment. There will be some feedback back to the demand planning side. There may be some activities to reconcile the differences between those two to get to kind of what we'll call a balanced supply and demand plan. That leads us to the pre-S&OP meeting. At this point, finance, sales, marketing, operations, materials, purchasing, all should be in alignment with what is the plan, and they're going to generate a view that they're going to take to the senior executives and kind of ratify and confirm what the plan is. There may be some comparisons we'll do to what we've done historically, so that as we go into the executive S&OP meeting, we're all kind of lined up in terms of what we should be doing. But the goal with the pre-S&OP meeting is that all the key stakeholders, and these are typically middle management or kind of lower level executives, are on board, agreed to the plan, and ready to go into the senior executives to get it ratified. And that's kind of what the executive S&OP meeting will do. Be a meeting of the minds. Here's the risks, here's the exposures, here's what we think our demand outlook should be. Finance is obviously keenly interested in what this looks like, because they want to be able to estimate cash flows and working capital requirements and all the other key elements that they've got. If I'm in production, I want to know what is going to be expected of my plants and my operations side. If I'm in supply planning, I've got to be able to work with my suppliers to be able to ensure that they're going to be able to meet the plan. So quite a bit of activity goes through that. We've got all the group lined up, and it, to me, felt a bit like aligning the stars and the planets. We're working so hard to get everything lined up to meet that demand plan, and all the relevant components are lined up and in sync, and we know where we've got risks, and we should be able to go execute this now. And so a little bit tongue in cheek here, we're saying it's just that easy, but this does, in most companies, And many middle market companies have not gone down the S&OP path because they just see it's too labor intensive. But there's a fair amount of corporate discipline and rigor required to make the traditional S&OP work effectively. And then what happens? We get a few weeks down the road, another month goes by, and we start to find that that plan that we had spent so much time creating is really not working out the way we had hoped. You know, the forecast was never quite right. There's gaps between what we were estimating and what's actually selling. Some things are selling much faster than we expected. Other things are not selling anywhere near what we expected. So we're starting to get inventory distortions. Our supply plan is misaligned. We get that bimodal inventory issue erupting as a result, where we've got too much of the wrong stuff, not enough of the right. Because of these misalignments, then on the operations side, we're doing firefighting, breaking production schedules, doing things that we can try to reconcile the gaps that eventually are emerging. And so even then, tier, they're trying to react as well. In operations, you know, you've got the drop-in orders that are coming and impacting our schedule stability. We've overutilized production capacity on building stock in items that aren't selling. That's robbed stock or capacity for those items that are. And in the IVAR example you heard earlier, how through DDMRP they got much better alignment around that. Now you keep repeating this, rinse and repeat over and over and over again. What happens is that people get worn out and they start to tolerate the process more than embrace it and utilize it. And a level of frustration often emerges because in spite of everybody's well-intentioned and trying to do the right thing, we find ourselves continually kind of out of alignment. And I mean, even some of the biggest corporations in the world who you would think would be able to master such a logical process flow. I mean, the whole concept seems quite clear and intuitive and whatnot, and yet it still doesn't give them results. And I've talked to a very senior executive at a large consumer products company who said, yeah, we abandoned traditional S&OP, 20 years ago because we found it really wasn't giving us the kind of results, especially in light of the level of effort that went into it. So, what's the problem statement here? Forecasts aren't accurate, right? That's kind of the core dimension that DDMRP is designed to help us kind of circumvent or mitigate. The capabilities are subject to variation. So while you have a plan and you think you can produce at this level, you may or may not be because of a lot of other factors that are going to influence the actual story as we go forward. If we're planning too far ahead, we're committing resources to the forecast well before we know actual demand, and therefore we're utilizing capacity, production, and materials in a way that may not actually meet what the real market requirement is. So it takes a lot of effort, doesn't always yield the kind of results that we're expecting. Is there a better way? And that's where the concept of the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model that the Demand-Driven Institute has presented, I think, makes so much sense. The philosophy is as follows, and this is their material, and so I'm just utilizing it here to help convey the way they describe the picture and put my own personalization on it. The philosophy in demand-driven, pace to actual demand, not the forecast, but the real consumption. What is the industry actually consuming of our products? The two key components of a demand-driven operating model are DDMRP for materials and demand-driven capacity scheduling and execution for optimizing the use of your production scheduling and resources. And the whole idea here is we want to pace to real demand. On the right side of the model, every company is evolving. We're going in different directions, and we need to be able to anticipate the changes that are coming as we move forward. So we can't just sit here in our DDOM and be ignorant about what may come in the next quarter or two. The difference is that we shouldn't use those forward-looking views to generate production commitments or material commitments. What we should use those forward-looking views to do is understand whether our DDOM model is resilient enough to adapt to whatever conditions may arrive. If we can continue to maintain pacing to actual demand, we get the benefit of a clearer demand signal, while we'll use the forecast not to generate a master production schedule and plan well out into the future. We're going to whether our operating model, in other words, our capacity footprint in production and our material buffers and other factors like that, are going to be adaptable enough to be flexible. If we can be adaptive and responsive, and you heard Erik talking a lot about resilience in his comments, then we don't need to be as dependent on the forecast. We get the benefit of a cleaner demand signal. As well as the operating model continues to operate week by week by week, we learn things, and variance analysis allows for this concept of tactical reconciliation. Where do we need to make adjustments in our buffer settings? Where do we need to change our time buffers from a production scheduling? Are there sprint capacities we need to implement by adding additional machine horsepower or resources in certain areas to give us more sprint capacity should changes occur in the market that we can't anticipate? So in DD&S&OP is to think not about alignment. It's not about aligning the stars and the planets. It's about knowing how to deal with variation that may occur. And it's quite important that we do this in the right lens. In other words, if our longest lead times are, say, 8 to 10 weeks, we don't need to do an S&OP plan that goes way out into the future, because it's going to change before we get there anyhow. Let's focus on those changes that may occur to us within what we'll call a tactical horizon. And there's a chart coming up here in a few minutes that'll help illustrate that. We want to maximize on flow. In our operating model can be, the more we'll be able to flow to material that's being required in the market. We can only generate revenue off things that actually sell. We can't generate revenue off things that sit in inventory. So we want to maximize on flow. The more we can improve flow, the more our supply chain is going to benefit. Variation is one of the key enemies of flow. And so mitigating variation through how we apply elements in our demand-driven operating model is critical to how we operate going forward. And the more we have visibility to what's called the relevant information, the more effective we can be. I use a story from my time at IBM with how many Java engineers we needed in 18 or 24 months, when literally in hours I can find and hire a bunch of Java developers through suppliers in a heartbeat. But architects were a lot more difficult, and so we needed a longer horizon to be managing from against those. Relevant information has to do with your lead times, your response times, and what variability you can absorb in your demand-driven operating model. And so if you've got visibility to those factors, now instead of looking at aligning the stars and the planets, we look more for exception management. Think about it like a pilot in a commercial airliner who's letting the system fly the plane, but is monitoring for exception conditions that may require intervention, like a storm on the horizon that we need to navigate around, or some other factor like that. So, so we've got to look where we need to. If we want to do a long-term plan because we've got strategic issues, like do we need a new plant in the next 24 months? Yes, let's do that. But let's use that for the right purpose. Let's not try to plan way out into the future on horizons that are well beyond our lead times, because we're going to be foolish believing that that's actually relevant information. So how do we gain that visibility? How do we utilize that to improve the way we manage our supply chain? And how can DD&S&OP really help us in this environment? First and foremost, understand your relevant ranges. If I have short lead times, I want to look at my DD&S&OP over a horizon that's really related to that. In our advanced planning module, you've got the ability to set the horizon around which alert signals will be generated. And so you want to make sure it's adequate time to make adjustments to your DDOM configurations. Maybe you need to increase your buffer sizes or add adjustment factors. But don't go too far out, because before you get there, something's going to change. That's the nature of de-risking your forecast, is shorten the horizon to the greatest degree possible. Implement that flow-based operating model, and that really goes into implementing DDMRP on the material side and demand-driven capacity scheduling in your demand-driven operating model. Utilize flow-based metrics. Make sure you don't buy into large minimum order quantities, which have an inherently slower flow rate to them, because you're going to buy a lot of material all at once that is going to sit on the shelves until it gets consumed. And then clearly make sure you're doing tactical reconciliation between the relevant ranges, so that you look at, are there exception conditions that are coming up? Let's focus on those. Otherwise, if the model is going to be resilient enough to deal with whatever the forecast is bringing to us, we don't need to make changes. And so the less is more. Let's focus on knowing the right things instead of knowing everything. And I think this chart is so critical because it helps you understand our history provides data for reconciling how we've been operating in the recent past. And the trend reports and other analytics that we've got in our advanced analytics module can all be driven around helping you have the right insights to understand, are there adjustments we need to make in our model. In DDS&OP, then, we also want to be looking at those forecast signals as a way of alerting us, like the radar screen in the commercial airliner, as to whether there are conditions coming along that may cause exceptions. We should also understand that relevant ranges may mean different past thresholds. Maybe we don't just plumb to one demand plan that is formally agreed across the organization. Maybe what we should be doing is looking at high, medium, and low ranges so that we can kind of stress test our demand-driven operating model to ensure it's going to be adaptable to expected conditions as we move down the road. And so it's thinking about this process of sales and operations planning, not in terms of alignment, but in terms of exception management. Where do we need to make adjustments in our demand-driven operating model so that we can get better leverage out of our resources? If there's a promotion, like in consumer goods, if you're campaigning a certain range of soft drinks in certain periods through the retail channel, you're going to need adjustments. You may need to pre-build some stock depending on how heavy that campaign is. There may be factors like plant shutdowns where you've got to do maintenance overhaul on several of the machines in the plant. So you need to build ahead to satisfy the demand that you're not going to be able to produce products in during the period of your plant shutdown. It can be all sorts of other factors like that. Maybe there are assumptions in some of the buffer profiles that are overly generous, and we can find that we can lean things down a bit further because they're becoming rather steady runners, and we may have applied them to more rigorous buffer zone settings. So you can look at this problem in a different way. And if instead of trying to be, the industry is so much focused on predictive analytics and getting everything lined up, well, demand-driven MRP has shown us that if we adopt a cleaner demand signal, which is what's actually selling in the market, we get better results. If we can expand that same philosophy now to our whole operating environment and think about S&OP as about really looking for the ensure we adjust our model accordingly, then we stand to have less work to do and to get a better result in the process. So think of this as a lighter touch, but more effective, more focused way. The best way I can describe it is we don't need to know everything to know the right things. And the whole point of DDS&OP and relevant ranges is to help you understand what are the right things to focus on so you can put your time and attention in on those. We all have so much work to do. Let's try to make our lives a little bit easier in the process. So how do you do this? You got to start with getting your demand-driven operating model. You can't really do DDS&OP unless you at least have demand-driven MRP in place for your materials. Some industries may not need the demand-driven capacity scheduling as much as others, but obviously if you can complement the use of your production resources against the same demand-driven signals, you're going to be in a much, much better place. And we'll be talking about our migration of DBR Plus into the cloud tomorrow and sharing with you some insights on that, which really will allow you in one platform to have the two major components of a DDOM in place at the same time. Then you can, from there, start to talk about a demand-driven S&OP process and look at leveraging tools like the R Plus Advanced Planning Module and the actual choreography of a demand-driven S&OP process to focus on understanding the forecast, but not going down too far of the rabbit hole about getting it perfect, but instead using it as a way to interpret where there may be exposures in your demand-driven operating model, and using those insights to influence and prepare yourself, and over time to build your operating model to be more resilient. If we could build infinite flexibility in our operating model, we wouldn't need a forecast. Whatever orders came in, we'd be able to respond to. Now that's rather optimistic and rather theoretical. I understand that. But if we can move in that direction, we stand to gain quite a bit of benefit because the more adaptable, the more flexible we are. Certainly the COVID pandemic has helped us learn some hard lessons about being flexible and things like that. We can be in a much, much better situation. The tactical reconciliation that the DD-S&OP process should help you understand is, how are we performing? Is our operating model resilient? Where did we have breakdowns? How do we protect ourselves against those in the future? Along with the model configuration aspects that tell you, hey, there's some planned events or there's some expected activity in the market we need to be prepared for, and monitor those adjustment factors you put in place, because as you get closer to that point of need, maybe the demand requirement is going to evolve. It may get larger, it may get smaller, it may move in time, or it may move out in time, and this will help you ensure that any adjustment factors you're applying are really going to be tuned and supporting you at those times when those come along. You heard Erik talk about the fact that as the time elapses, the forecast accuracies from the OEMs started to improve in the in the auto industry. So you kind of need to be proceeding a bit with caution in terms of what some of those forward-looking signals may be, but to the degree you can utilize them to prepare yourself, then obviously you're going to be in a better state. Now, having DD-S&OP, now you can start thinking about bigger picture, longer term, more strategic questions around, how do we truly become an adaptive enterprise? How do we use the process and what we've learned out of DDOM, the use of DD-S&OP, to enable ourselves to be much, much more flexible and much more resilient going forward? There is a lot of information about this. We can teach the Demand-Driven Leader program. We also have done adaptive enterprise workshops for clients. All of the content is available through the Demand-Driven Institute, so there's a wealth of information you can utilize to get a better understanding about the principles of DD-S&OP as you go forward. So with that, we've got about 5 minutes left. If any of you have questions, please ask, because we've got a few minutes to take them, and I'll try to do the best I can to address them here. So Jonathan asks, actually, we need forecasts for the variability in ADU of the part for the buffer profiles. At what extent do we use forecasts? That's a great question, Jonathan. One of the key factors we look at are FDU versus ADU variance. You have to get some understanding of how much forecast bias you're dealing with in your environment. In some industries, they're utilizing forecasted daily usage as their demand signal for sizing their buffers. And in those cases, typically their forecast has relatively high accuracy. Some of our consumer goods clients have pretty good forecasts. Their products are rather steadily consumed, and so they've got really no tangible difference between ADU and FDU. Others, they see a substantial bias where the rate of usage that's achieved isn't anywhere near what the forecast was. And one of the reports that we have in the analytics module allows you to compare. Think about it, if I've got a 10-week forecasted daily usage horizon in my system, and I'm using that to size my buffers, well then 10 weeks later, if I look at the ADU for those parts, I should see a similar value to what the FDU was 10 weeks earlier. And in fact, we've used this with Aptiv as a technique because some of their products are not pulling at the rate that the OEMs are forecasting, and this helps them get better understanding, and they've made some adjustments in their buffer profile settings to accommodate for that. In the other case, you may see that the rate of consumption is higher, and if we use ADU only, we may be short-sighting the buffer and it may not be able to keep up with the rate of demand. So it's going to be, Jonathan, very situationally dependent, and you need to be flexible in terms of looking at the right analytics. That goes back to that tactical reconciliation that I was talking about earlier, to ensure that you've got the right signals driving your buffer values. See if there's any other questions out there. We've got a few more minutes. Anyone? Okay, looks like we're at the end here in terms of questions. I want to encourage you to attend the next sessions, which will be starting at, I believe, 12:25 or 12:30. So thank you so much for your time and attention today. Hope you found this useful, and we'd love to help you on your demand-driven journey. So y'all have a good day now. Thanks, everybody.